We begin with a memory test. You ready? I'm going to give you 5 seconds to memorize a string of digits. Please don't write it down or type it down.
7.
Do your best. A string of digits. Correct. Psychology 101. Are you ready? Whoop, no. 7. Whoop, gotta. Okay, what were those digits?
835 291 7906.
Again?
Go ahead. 853
835.
291.
2901.
You're doing very well, Brad. Very well. That was a bit tough, wasn't it? Let's try something a little bit easier. 5 seconds. Please.
1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 4, 5.
Oh,
Combination.
well, that was much easier, wasn't it? Why was that much easier? Because we have, oh, I've got to get used to this. This machine is right to left and I'm left to right. We're getting, okay, wait a second. Giving away all the crown jewels. Okay, this was much easier because this is a familiar these are familiar patterns. If you know to count. The first one was hard, and the idea here is simply that humans are very bad at remembering sequential information on a short-term basis. We are, as countless psychologists have emphasized, limited capacity processors. Morton Christensen has called this the now or never bottleneck. It's visually presented information like strings of letters or auditorily presented information. You don't get it immediately, you're going to lose it. Use it or lose it sort of idea. So what do? We chunk. The human brain chunks information into easy to remember combinations, important word, combinations, that become familiar with practice. At the beginning, I gave you 10 bits of information, all those hard to remember numbers, but now we've compressed, condensed, combined them into 3 chunks or units, and that makes it a lot easier. And of course, that's the reason why we do this. Oh, dear, oh dear. Oh. We chunk, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units here, but it's much easier to remember them. And that's why car number plates work that way. We group them into chunks, which are easier to recall. Okay. Yes. I want to argue that I'm going to come back to this chunking idea and the limitations of human attention, memory, perception, and argue that the quintessence of reading skill, skill is actually word recognition speed. Okay, my field is learning to read, cognitive psychology, psycholinguistics, speed and effortlessness. Often we hear the word automaticity. Yes, the goal is comprehension. And literacy learning is much more than just recognizing words, but I work in a learning disabilities department, and most learning disabled persons are dyslexic persons, and they have troubles with word reading, and that's their big problem. If you can't recognize the words, you're not going to be able to understand the text. And this is really essential, being fast and automatic is crucial. That brings me, okay, coming back to the idea of combination, combining elements. I want to talk about combinatoriality. I've called my new universal model of reading the combinatorial model, based on the combinatorial principle. The idea that both in nature, in human language, both spoken and written, we combine and recombine a finite number of elements into an infinite number of higher order units. This is the productivity of language, generativity of language, but you also see it in complex natural systems. We all learned the periodic table of elements, a limited number of basic chemicals, or I've forgotten, that was going back a long way, school days. The table of elements, the elementary units of the physical universe. In my day, there was a few dozen. Now there's probably a few hundred. The periodic table of elements gives you the basic building blocks of more complex molecules, such as the DNA molecule. We all have, everyone in this room looks different, and yet our DNA is based on precisely the same 5 elements. I won't go into details here, that are rearranged in different ways to provide infinite variation, just as language should. Language gives us infinite variation of expression from a small, a finite number of elements. This is an idea, goes back to from Humboldt, infinite ends from finite means, Hockett's dual patterning, you'll remember that, or Martinez double articulation. Spoken language is also combinatorial. A simple example of phonological combinatoriality, let's assume 10 consonants in a language with 10 vowels. If we have a look at the number of possible CVC, consonant vowel consonant syllables, we've already up to nearly 1,000, not quite. Now we look at polysyllabic words, up to 4 syllables in a word. Even that's a very modest number. We now have 1 trillion possible words of up to 4 syllables. Okay, phonological combinatoriality. Combinatoriality gives us, in spoken language, actually gives us or produces combinations and combinations of combinations in a nested hierarchy, enabling us to construct multiple hierarchically nested, one within the other, levels of combinatoriality, limited number of phonemes, allows us to build a larger number of morphemes. Morphemes make up even a larger number of words, and so on, phrases, clauses, text, hypertext, and so on. Combinations of combinations, nested hierarchy. Okay, now we come to writing. In written language, and this is a theory about learning to read, a unit where I'm attempting to suggest what is common across every writing system as far as learning to read. Every possible writing system. We combine and recombine a finite and therefore learnable number of sublexical elements into an unlimited lexicon. So we have systematic, or in deeper orthographies, quasi-regular orthographies, some sort of mapping, matching, fitting. At the sublexical level, it might be letters in alphabets and abjads, syllables in alphasyllabaries, abogadas, syllabaries, morphemes in morphosyllabic systems, where we have systematic relationships between, again, limited number of building blocks that allows us to map phonology and meaning. It's something that's been neglected a lot in my field. Combinatoriality in a writing system serves two needs. It has to do two things, not one. It has to help the novice, and I'll talk about decipherability. It has to help the expert with unitizability, chunking, automatizability, to get to the speed you need to be able to comprehend what you're reading without getting bogged down decoding and figuring out what the word is in front of you. For the novice, a writing system has to provide decipherability. Educationalists often use the term decodability. I think decipher is more accurate. All words at some point for the child are new, are novel. Even the child's own name, at least when first encountered. So what the child needs is a way of independently identifying words first encountered. Even the child's own name, even my own name, when I first saw it in Hebrew letters, or I saw it written in Czech, with the Hacek, was novel. It's not a familiar pattern until I had decoded or deciphered it. Decipherability of a writing system depends on phonological transparency, phonological systematicity, if you like. It's a means that enables the learner to decipher and learn new words independently. You have to have some sort of regular, quasi-regular, linear B is fine, as long as you realize that sometimes you have to add the final consonant to your open core syllable. And this process must lay the foundations for what becomes the unitized, automatic, effortless, whole word direct retrieval mechanisms of familiar words. And I won't go into that too much. Okay. The expert reader needs something different, something more than decipherability. That's unitizability, chunking, required for fast, efficient reading. And here it depends on visually distinct, word-specific or morpheme-specific spellings. So it makes good sense that we have two ways of writing our homophones. And we see this in many languages, okay? Mist and mist. These signal two different meanings. The goal is meaning getting. That's why we read, not to sound out or decipher. Night with a K and without the K. Unitization, which is what the expert, the skilled reader needs, depends on, I'm taking this, borrowing from Henry Rogers, wrote about this some while ago. Two things. One, morpheme constancy. The same morpheme retains more or less the same spelling in different derivations and inflections. So English does this very well, has great morphemic transparency. By leaving the T in its verb derivation, soften, even though we don't hear it anymore. Soften should be S-O-F-F. And the same thing we have here, called, kissed, acted. We have consistent relationship, the same past tense suffix signaling the past tense of the verb, even though phonologically they are different realizations of the ED. Unitization also depends on morpheme distinctiveness. Different morphemes have different spellings. So we have the examples here. Here's another example from English, 2, 2, and 2. An example from Spanish, vaya, vaya, vaya. spelled differently, signaling more better connections, superior connections, if you like, between the letter string and its meaning. What we do, thank you. I suggest that there are two things happening when children learn to read, and this is an old idea that goes back over 100 years. We are building, and teachers in schools, at least in English, I know, will tell you we have to build a sight vocabulary, a reading vocabulary. This is a store, a mental store of chunks, letter strings. Psycholinguists call it the orthographic lexicon. How do we build this mental store of words that are instantly and effortlessly recognized without having to go through all that effortful, slow, laborious decoding, deciphering? And the answer is one by one. It's almost like you're building a logography. In every orthography, we need to build these word-specific spellings, okay? And they're even, because even English regular words, we have, this is an interesting question, and I don't want to, there are multiple ways of spelling words in most languages, even the ones that are very regular or transparent. David Roberts, are you paying attention? Yes. Which are very relevant, very regular from letter to sound. But the universal norm in writing systems, correct me if I'm wrong, I know Finnish is an exception, is when it comes to spelling the sounds you hear in a word, almost all or most, I'd be interested if someone has data or a paper on that, you have multiple options. Okay. I would dare to argue that this idea of combinatoriality even applies in Chinese. Most, something like 80% of the words or the compound characters in Chinese are made up of sublexical units. A semantic, radical, phonetic, one hints at sound, one hints at meaning. You've seen this before. There's a limited number of those too. It's not unlimited. We have about 200 or 214 of these in, and yes, there are hundreds, 700, 800, 900 of these, but I'm not sure how many are needed when a child is reading, learning to read. We don't have data on that. We know there's 600 in school Chinese, if you look at elementary schools. And in fact, if you have a look at the literature on reading research, how children learn to read, Hua Shu at Beijing and the other students from Richard Anderson's group did a whole lot of work some time ago. I don't know whether that's been revised or refuted, I'm not sure, but she still adheres to this conclusion that she made. Researchers found that children do not memorize characters as a whole in learning to read. They decompose characters into sublexical units. This is the finite, learnable number of elements that gives us the infinite expression when they're combined. And there's similar conclusions for alpha syllabaries also from Shonali Nag, now at Oxford. Okay, I'm not going to go into depth. This combinatorial model has different phases of learning to read. That's not really what's important for this group. It's more relevant for educators. But these different combinatorial phases all demonstrate different levels, if you like, of productive use of script-specific combinatoriality, basic building blocks to identify unfamiliar words beginning with letters, translation letters or aksharas, or syllabograms into larger meaningful units, those meaningful units, words and morphemes into phrases, and so on and so on. So there are, the combinatorial model here is a dualistic model. Two things are happening. Children are two developmental streams occurring in more or less parallel. Children or learners are getting better at deciphering using the regularities, the systematicities of the system, and getting better at identifying novel words. There are always new words, not only in children's reading, but in adults' reading. You have to have a way of deciphering, figuring out the identity of those. But at the same time, you're building up this store one by one, recognition of familiar items. You are expanding the orthographic lexicon, your sight vocabulary, teachers will call it, which is basically familiarity with whole morphemes and whole words. And to conclude, I'm going to, I think this sums it up very nicely. A writing system specialist, Marshall Unger, stated that a writing system capable of transcribing any utterance in its associated language necessarily combines phonographic and logographic techniques. Perhaps people here would be more comfortable with the word morphographic to anticipate the next speaker, Terry, and therefore invokes both phonological recoding, that's the deciphering or decoding that I talked about, the figuring out an unfamiliar letter string, and the identification of whole words or morphemes. Thank you.
We are very late. We have time for only one question.
I want to know if there's some current language like apps like Duolingo. I really don't like Duolingo just because I think they teach it.
You don't like what?
Duolingo.
What's that?
Oh, it's like the most common language learning app that exists right now. It just
Okay.
it can help people from like starting a new language from scratch. And the way it teaches it is it teaches you nouns first, and it basically is like if you were learning Spanish, you say hombre and then hombre, and it would show a picture of a man, and you have to like multiple choice click it, and so it really is like noun based.
Learning to read a language or learning to speak a language or both? Okay.
And you can learn con lines on this as well, which is really interesting. But I find it not helpful for people who have some kind of like linguistic knowledge. The way I learn languages really well is I like to learn the rules and learn the exceptions to the rules. So I was wondering if you had any takes on like noun first versus verb first.
Well, I would make a more general point in that these systems work fine if you already know the systematicities of the Roman alphabet. But what good is that for someone who is not literate, a pre-literate or a non-literate? So that makes perfect sense.
Well, Duolingo can also teach you different script languages as well. Like they have Chinese on there, they have Arabic
It's
on there.
just
So they all sort of
Joyce.
teaching you a new
He was
script
on the desktop today.
in the same noun first way.
Desktop.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'm
Oh,
not able to comment on the noun first way, but I would be very doubtful. And I know a lot of psycholinguistic cognitive psychologists who would agree that unless you are going down to the orthographic detail and come to understand why the letters or the symbols are what they are and not something else, because they connect to sounds you have in your head or are learning, I don't think you're gonna, I would predict total failure for those apps. Work for a system you know, but not for one that you don't.